The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by InMobi. Today, we are going to be speaking about the impact of COVID-19 on CPG and CPG marketing. We have a lot to cover today, so I am going to dive in so we can get started. Just a quick update. So as far as logistics are concerned, this is going to be a 30-minute webinar, so we have a lot to cover in the next 30 minutes. If we have time for questions, we are going to leave time at the end to answer those. We'll also include some contact information if you want to get a hold of us with any questions that you may have later on. And of course, following this webinar, we will be sending a recording of today's talk along with a copy of the slides. The purpose to quickly go over, we really wanted to better understand consumer behavior in light of everything that's going on, specifically as it relates to mobile consumer behavior for major CPG brands within the CPG space. An overview of the specifics of what we'll discuss today. We'll give some quick intros of this voice that is speaking to you, along with some of the data that we are looking at. We will then look at the data specifically, highlighting what behavior is changing and who is changing their behavior, and also looking at the apps that are helping to facilitate some of these behavioral changes within the CPG space. We'll then go over the industry as a whole, highlighting the current state of CPG and what brands are doing to pivot specifically as it relates to advertising and marketing. We'll then finalize everything with a few predictions of what we think will happen within the next few months, and if we have any time, any questions. So thank you all for joining us today. My name is Matt Kaplan. I'm the Content Marketing Manager here at InMobi out of our San Francisco office, and very happy today to be joined by Jeremy Huber.
Thanks, Matt. So as Matt said, I'm Jeremy Huber. I'm out of the Kansas City office of InMobi. I head up the audience intelligence teams of North America. Our teams, we work with brands and agencies through both our SaaS platforms, which include InMobi Audience Platform, the Consumer Insights Platform, and our Pulse Market Research Platform, as well as doing custom audience intelligence projects, all by leveraging our unique data sources here in the US to develop insights and create audiences for media activation. Back to you, Matt.
Fantastic, thanks, Jeremy. And as I mentioned before, a lot of InMobi first-party data will serve as the basis for this webinar. Jeremy, can you speak a little bit about InMobi's data sources that were used?
Sure, yeah, so any of those joining us today, they're unfamiliar with some of our data here in North America. I'm going to focus first on the data set on the left, which is our observed data sources. One of the things that really makes InMobi unique in the US is our large group of first-party carrier data users. We have an always-on data feed of over 30 million users for which we see location signals every couple of minutes throughout the day because their phone always has to be on to ping a tower. We know all apps installed across device, and that goes for both Android and iOS users. In addition to that, we know a good amount of their mobile web engagement. And so we collect all that data through our data science team. It's curated and supports a lot of the solutions and a lot of the stuff you're going to see today. One more point before we move past this side of data is that a lot of the data that we have there, when we speak to demographics, it's Experian verified demographic data. So it's not stated data. We do have a tremendous amount of stated data as well, but that first party carrier data is backed by Experian verified demographics. So when you see us speak to things like age, gender, ethnicity, household income, presence of children from an observed standpoint, know that it's coming from that real pure data source. The last data set that I'll speak to on the right side here is our market research data. So similar to our reach, our media reach in North America and globally, we have the ability to reach over 270 million monthly actives in the US and 1.3 billion globally, for which we do direct consumer market research. So that's all that stated data. So at InMobi, we combine both data sources for our brands and partners to have a complete view of the mobile consumer.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jeremy. And now let's dive into some of the specific data that we've seen and observed. So just as a highlight, what behavior is changing right now? So despite everything happening in the world, consumers have reported to us, this is a survey that we conducted back in April, that they have increased spending in some way. So we're talking almost 2/3 of consumers and over 2/3 of those 18 to 35. So that's the Gen Z millennial crowd. What are they spending more on? Hardly surprising. Number one is groceries. People are definitely eating more at home, followed by household care items, so they can keep their home clean and well maintained, followed by entertainment. Of course, how that entertainment looks is shifting a little bit, which we'll get into later. And where they're spending their money has changed a little bit as well. So we see half of consumers said they are spending online more frequently. Even though supermarkets, pharmacies, convenience stores are all still open, many consumers are reticent to go to those physical locations. And so we're seeing e-commerce and specifically m-commerce seeing an uptick. That being said, there are some differences in behaviors. There are some major categories where spending is down. As we've noted here, 83% have decreased spending at some capacity. It is worthwhile to note, of course, that some of those are in categories that you can't really spend in right now. Think travel and transportation. One thing to note, 88% of consumers have changed their grocery buying behavior since the pandemic began. Again, people are stocking up more. They want to make sure they have a longer length of supplies. And so we are seeing some changing grocery buying behavior as a result. In terms of timelines, when we first started surveying individuals back in March, we did find that a significant portion expected to be impacted over the next 2 to 3 months. And in some parts of the country, that certainly is looking to be the case now. But we've definitely all of us had to revise some of the timelines that we're looking at here. We don't know when this will end, and in the impact that the pandemic has had does vary very much by region. What it looks like here in California is different than what it looks like in other parts of the country. As far as who is changing their behavior, one of the things we really wanted to highlight is the fact that households with kids are really changing their behavior significantly. We can see that these are the households that are spending more on overall and spending more specifically on household care items and on groceries. Most schools across the country are closed right now. And so with more people at home, it's those families in particular that have had to adjust their habits and buying behaviors as a result. We're also noticing that women are spending more than, or a greater proportion of women are spending more than men on certain key categories. In addition as well, we wanted to take a look at who by age range is changing their buying behavior. So the younger cohort, the youngest demographic, definitely spending more on entertainment. But really what's been interesting is that in that grocery and household care item space, the people who are spending the most are people between the ages of 35 and 56. And Jeremy, I know when we took a look at the data that seeing a spend increase within this demographic definitely caught your eye. Can you speak a little bit more about people who are in these age ranges?
Yeah, sure, Matt. Thanks. So again, listeners, back to the point about observed and stated data, a lot of what you're seeing here is based off that survey. Similarly, we looked at app installers or mobile web engagers with different CPG related or grocery or pharmacy related brands and saw very similar shifts. Specifically in the grocery related app area, we look at, of course, day by day, month by month trends, pre-COVID versus during COVID. What we're seeing during COVID is there is still even an increase in the female audience, 36 and above, making 75,000 plus in income and more Caucasian than other ethnicities that are taking more actions with brand or third-party related grocery delivery apps.
And so getting into those apps, so first we wanted to take a look specifically at some of the third-party apps. A few particular apps that we wanted to highlight. So Instacart seeing a lot of growth. These percent increases that you see are from March specifically, when most of the country went into shelter in place. Instacart in the third-party space definitely has a lot of brand name recognition. We're seeing growth there. Shipped as well, seeing a lot of growth. So while Shipped is owned by Target, you can use Shipped for a variety of locations. Other ones that we wanted to highlight here, Drizzly, which is specifically an alcohol delivery app. It has been seeing a lot of growth. We all have to get through this pandemic somehow, so hardly surprising to see that they're seeing some growth as well. And we also want to highlight Postmates. So Postmates is very much more in the prepared food delivery space, but compared to competitors like Uber Eats or DoorDash, Postmates does allow you to get some grocery and food items delivered to you. So within that space, they're seeing a lot of growth, and so hardly surprising because it's a little bit more options that you can get through Postmates versus some other apps. But we're also seeing a lot of growth specifically within the apps that are owned by the grocery stores themselves. We have a few categories here that we've highlighted that have seen growth. And Jeremy, when we were talking before, you noted that these apps are in some ways have some similarities, but also some key differences from some of these third-party apps.
Yeah, Matt. Correct. So what we're actually observing and segmenting out for audience purposes on behalf of our partners and brands is looking at different segments of users that are taking these actions. So Kroger, for example, or a Publix, what we're identifying are either brand loyalists, and we know that because, again, think back on our location data signals that we have in the US that are very strong. We look at people that physically may have visited a Kroger pre-COVID, and then maybe during COVID, they've since installed that app. So we look at those as more brand loyalists. In addition to that, we have segments of users that maybe hadn't previously physically visited one of these locations, but perhaps a Kroger, or we're seeing a lot of traction with in this space, Walmart and Target specifically, because they're doing the curbside delivery. So interesting trends are that it used to be that there were very defined lines from a demographic and a psychographic perspective on some users when you're looking at, say, Walmart versus Target versus maybe a Kroger. However, what we're seeing during COVID is those lines are really beginning to blur. And they're blurred because consumers are looking for more options for contactless type of transactions. So maybe a person didn't physically visit a Walmart before, but because of these new offerings that Walmart's providing, consumers are downloading the Walmart app, and we know that they're using them for some sort of a curbside delivery. So we're watching those different segments of users, both demographically and psychographically, start to shift, all the while, again, using that data to inform those new audience segments for both new outreach by CPG brands and also retargeting efforts.
Great. So now that we have a sense of the behavior that's changing and how apps are facilitating behavior within key demographics, let's dive into the CPG space. So a few quick things that we wanted to highlight here. One, for a lot of the major players within the CPG space, they have been seeing some really key growth. Procter and Gamble has definitely been leading the way, but we're buying paper goods, we're buying shelf-stable food products, we're buying drinks. A lot of players in the CPG space have seen an uplift in sales as a result of everything that's happening in the world. And a lot of that, is happening on digital channels. We mentioned a number of apps that have been seeing some install growth. Certainly the big players in the e-commerce space like Amazon, a lot of those transactions are happening there. And that's in fact even caused some difficulties. Supply chains are heavily impacted, especially supply chains that are reliant on China. And so some of the big e-commerce players have had to adjust consumer expectations around shipping and delivery as a result, even as demand is seeing a major increase. One thing I want to highlight as far as is some of the types of products that are changing. So really interesting interview with the head of Walmart recently, who noted that there was 4 distinct phases so far of the pandemic. The first one, where people were buying a lot of products specifically designed to protect yourself against the virus. So surging sales of soap, of hand sanitizer, of face masks, of disposable gloves, those types of items. The second phase is toilet paper. We all have seen those pictures and the news stories of how toilet paper hoarding behavior was going up. Certainly during this phase, the bidet industry was cleaning up, and that was very much a phase all of its own. The third phase has been more food related. In particular, Walmart called out surging sales of ham, but a lot of people stocking up on items like beans, shelf-stable food items that they can have on hand. And we recently are now in a fourth phase, which is defined by beauty and personal care products. So now that people are stuck at home, starting to establish a little bit of a new routine, seeing sales of hair dye, of nail polish, other personal care items are starting to see surges as, we can't go to salons or barber shops anymore. So we're trying to take things into our own hands. And so, with all of this happening, Jeremy, what are CPG brands doing to pivot specifically as it relates to advertising and marketing right now?
Yeah, sure, Matt. So, and before we maybe dive into some of the first icon on the left here, when Matt was walking through some of those previous points, it reminds me of some of the things that we're working on currently with some of our CPG media clients, and that is that attribution has been, key in the CPG industry, right? And a lot of the attribution partners look at specifically footfall and or receipt tape visibility. So they're actually looking at purchases through a partner, many partners out there that provide that kind of detail by consumer. However, one thing that's been challenging during COVID, and there will be a segment of these users continuing post-COVID, is that the consumer of the product, the person that's actually using that purchase, isn't in many cases the person actually making the purchase. And so think of, again, the Target app. So a lot of these consumers that are buying their products currently through the Target app, although they are paying for it and picking it up curbside, the actual purchaser of that is a Target employee. And so brands, or CPG specific brands, and our media agency partners are looking to us to help them understand users that are engaging with those types of first and third party apps for attribution. If you know that they're engaging with the Target app, we know that they're making purchases, and we can then provide some opportunities for that one-to-one connection to that consumer. But again, moving on to what they're doing to pivot. A couple of things that anybody on this call that's familiar with CPG brands knows. CPG is real heavy in live sporting events, right? That's where you see a lot of the media spend happening historically. Obviously today, with sporting events truly just being put on hold, the upcoming Olympics have been suspended for at least a year. CPG brands are pushed to different channels at a higher rate. Okay, and that's trending more towards that mobile, because people, as we know, and we have the stats to bear that out, consumers are spending a tremendous amount of time during COVID, more time than they were spending previously on their mobile devices, whether it be for entertainment, gaming, and many other different apps in different segments. And so instead of physically visiting sporting events or watching sporting events on TV, they're looking to their mobile device and connected TV for entertainment. So CPG brands have been shifting a lot of their spend to those different channels. And another reason for that too, and we touch on it here in this next icon and category, the linear TV market has been another large area of spend for CPG brands. The challenge, of course, is that requires a large upfront commitment for multiple months in many cases. CPG brands that we work with are looking to be a lot more they're looking for the ability to shift and to be agile and adapt in near real time to changing in consumer behavior. So again, mobile and connected TV allows brands and media agencies to adapt in that way, right? Because that's based off of usage, whether it's somebody watching some content or somebody engaging with their mobile device, those ad calls come through and increase in usage. So we're finding that brands are looking to us and other mobile-based providers to allow for that type of flexibility on increasing spend within specific audience segments due to the shift in consumer behavior.
Yeah, and I think some of that is also led to a shift in the type of advertising and messaging that we've seen as well, right? I think we've all seen the advertising that talks about how the brand is here for you. Certainly we've seen a shift in more branding-based advertising and messaging, highlighting what the brand is doing to help, and that includes creative that shows what people are dealing with. Creative that shows a crowd at a concert isn't going to resonate today because that's not what we can do. Of course, I think one thing to note is that the space is really shifting. And so that the type of messaging that resonated with audiences in March or in April isn't necessarily going to be the type of messaging that resonates with audiences in May and in June, and really highlights the need to be flexible and to really have your finger on the pulse of consumers as situations change. I think wanted to close things out here with some predictions of what we think will happen next. As we mentioned, we don't know when this will end, and when it will end is going to differ very much by geography. And I think that requires CPG brands to have a very long-term plan in place so that they are able to adapt as the situation shifts. And of course, as the situation shifts, as we just touched on, messaging needs to be very finely tuned. The wrong messaging at this time could really cause undue damage to a brand. And so getting the creatives right in a specific time and place is very key. A last point I want to stress here as well, there are certain brands and certain offerings that have seen a lot of organic growth, right? Certainly every toilet paper brand or Purell, for example, have seen a lot of organic growth. But to what extent will that translate to continued growth? I think that is still yet to be determined, and very interesting to see Clorox recently announced that they will be increasing their advertising coming up, increasing their marketing in the near future. While certainly Clorox cleaning products have seen an organic boost, it's really beneficial now to pair that with marketing and with advertising efforts to ensure that the brand can stay top of mind and really use this time to stay in the minds of consumers, to stay on top of minds. So really critical at this stage. So Jeremy, I know there's definitely going to be some changes coming up that we predict as far as consumer preferences and habits are concerned. Can you speak more to those?
Yeah, sure, Matt. So certainly we anticipate more at-home consumer preferences, right? In fact, we're definitely focused in on three specific audience segments within that at-home consumer as we start to not just continue through COVID, but begin to come out of COVID. And not just, I mean, again, some are predicting a potential wave 2 of COVID, but even without that, the cold and flu season of Q4 is probably going to have a bit of a heightened sense for people. And so what we are continuing to observe here at InMobi are really three core audience segments that are still in this kind of COVID at home consumer preference area. The first is, as we start to come out of COVID, we're identifying that some users are going to want to get back to their pre-COVID behaviors, right? I mean, they're raring to go. Their preference is to physically shop at stores. They'd like to get out to sporting events once those open back up. They may want to start getting back to theaters for their primary entertainment. So that would be one segment that we're watching. So again, we're looking back on these people that were physically taking these behaviors pre-COVID, didn't during COVID for lack of ability, and then are beginning to once again return to their pre-COVID habits here by region, by state. The second group that we're watching is more of a blended approach. So that's the consumer that has started to adopt or just adopt some new habits, but it's more around convenience and cost savings. So there will be times that these consumers still physically shop a store because it's convenient for them, but if they're looking for alternative forms of purchasing, they may still do an app. So think about these as we're watching the physical and the digital for all of these segments, but there will be a segment of used consumers who both still physically and use their mobile device to engage with some of these brands that provide their CPG products. And then the third segment that we're watching, and again, the size of each of these is going to be very interesting, and they're going to increase and decrease through time. But the third is those that have truly established new habits. And again, just my wife is one of them, right? We had some stuff delivered. She was a big Amazon shopper, but now that we're accustomed to, Instacart, Costco delivery, Target curbside pickup, you start to weigh out the true convenience and the cost of those different options. And so the third segment that we're watching, again, and creating audiences around is those that had behavior prior to COVID, have entered into new behaviors during COVID, and really sustain that new behavior of more of a mobile-based shopping option or contactless shopping going forward. So that's really what we're observing, and I know we'll be sharing a lot of that information as it comes out in subsequent months and quarters. The other thing that we anticipate seeing, which is a trend that we've been seeing, and I think you all have been seeing for a very long time, which is the time spent on mobile is just going to continue to increase. Once again, consumers and just users in general are finding that kind of forced into some of this activity, they're then understanding that it's really not as maybe some of the barriers have been lifted as to why they wouldn't do more gaming or entertainment or even shopping on their mobile device. So something that was already a trend had a bit of an accelerant poured on it here during COVID, and we anticipate that to continue to increase concurrently with brands and other providers marketing towards those services and really getting better about it. A lot of these grocers, convenience stores, pharmacies have been providing these types of solutions, but they've just really started putting an emphasis on it as of late as well. And then the last thing, and this just kind of wraps up everything we've been talking about up to this point, is that now is when, data is always important. Audiences and segmentation have always been important. One-to-one, messaging and connections to consumers have always been important, now more than ever, because again, consumers are behaving differently than they did before. And so with the visibility that we can provide and other partners can provide, it's just even more important to allow those to factor into your strategies and your buys. Back to you, Matt.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, I think it's an interesting time. While there are a lot of new behaviors and shifts, in some respect for many consumers, it's just accelerating certain trends and habits that were already there beforehand. Fantastic. So that leads us to the end of our webinar. We have about a minute to answer any questions that we may have. So let's take a look. So this is a great question. Thank you. Do you have any data about how these changes in consumer behavior are changing in other countries? Is it very similar to the US?
Yeah, great question. And we are, again, back to that slide about our data, again, we have about 1.3-ish billion monthly active users that we have visibility to globally. It really is impacted mostly by measures that are taken by the local and not just local governments, but the governments as a whole in each country. For example, India right now has been in shelter in place. They were a little ahead of the curve as it relates to shutting down travel and other types of behaviors. And so it is really a country by country view. We definitely have some data signals and market research to support how it's going country by country, and we'd be happy to maybe take it offline and have a deeper conversation with that around that question to whomever's asking.
Yeah, and just a quick follow-up note, if you are interested in seeing some other materials, we have a lot of great assets on our blog, inmobi.com/blog, and we have a specific page just dedicated to our COVID-19 assets, inmobi.com/COVID-19. Well, everyone, thank you for tuning in. This concludes our webinar for today. If you have any additional questions or like anything else, please feel free to email me directly at matt.kaplan@inmobi.com. Thanks everyone again for tuning in. Hope you have a great day.